historical context of Esther is so rich and so unknown to most Christians. And so we get a lot of sermons on Esther 4:14, but we don't get a lot of the life that Esther lived. So what I wanted to do is talk about Esther, the person. And of course, we'll cover the typical topics that you do cover when you talk about Esther, Haman and Mordecai and the plot. But we do want to talk a little bit about history. So this is the verse that every pastor and every teacher uses. Esther 4:14. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So for such a time as this is that phrase that we all know and we love, but we don't quite dig into that phrase to see what it means to us. And what it really does mean to us is, like Esther, we are trapped in the present. God has created us to be people that live in the now. We can't live in the past. We can't move forward to the future. We're in the now. And every one of us is here for such a time as this. Whatever job we have, whatever institution we're in, we're there for a purpose, the same way Esther was. It may not be as dramatic or as life-threatening, but in that way, we're very much like Esther. And I wanted you to see in this verse Mordecai's perspective on God's sovereignty. So a lot of people will say, well, God's not mentioned in Esther. And you won't find God mentioned in Esther, and we'll talk about why. But what they don't do is focus on how God can be seen on every single page, and he can. And in this verse, Mordecai is telling Esther, he's encouraging her, she's frightened. And he's telling her, if you stay silent, so that's an option, just like for all of us. One option is to stay silent. Another option is to speak up and take the consequences. But he said, if you stay silent, deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. So his firm belief that God's sovereign plan was going to play out for his people. But he encouraged Esther to speak up. And so we won't spend too much time dissecting the book itself, but it is helpful to have some context. So the author of Esther is unknown. Unlike Paul's letters, we're not told up front who wrote this book. But there's a few clues that we can look at in the book that will help us. There's an intimate knowledge of the Persian court. There's an intimate knowledge of Persian customs. And there's a significant interest in Purim. So Purim is that Jewish feast that's celebrated every year, even today. And the Feast of Purim is the feast that celebrates the deliverance of the Jewish people by Esther. And there's a lot. I mean, you can look in chapter 9, and it has an entire layout on the Feast of Purim, what should be done there, and how you should celebrate it in perpetuity. And so many scholars believe, given all those facts, that it was likely a Persian Jew who wrote Esther. And Mordecai is probably the best candidate. But again, we don't honestly know. Then the book itself was probably written just after the events that it described. And that's right about the mid-5th century BC. It's 10 chapters long. You can read, I read through it last night again. So you can read through it really quickly. And it's written as historical narrative. So think about the book of Acts. And Luke wrote that book describing everything that the apostles did, everything that Paul did, all of his journeys, all of the times he was stoned and shipwrecked and all those things. Think about the book of Acts, but taking out the narrative about God's deliverance and God's providence and God's intervention. All of the interpretation of those things that Luke put in, take all that out, and you've got Esther. Esther is a historical narrative. It tells you what happened, but it does not tell you why. It relies on the reader to discern the why. The entire book of Esther, as we said, when the Jews celebrate Purim, even today, the first thing they'll do when the festival kicks off is they'll read the entire book of Esther. And they call it the Megillah. It's the entire book, all 10 chapters. and they'll read it. And then in the celebration of Purim, they'll dress up like characters from the book of Esther. And then they give gifts to people that are poor, and then they give gifts of food and other things to each other. So it's a huge deal in the Jewish community, and we'll talk about how it came to be. So who was Esther? It's hard to divorce who we are from our context. So we've got to talk a little bit about Esther's context. So she lived in the royal city of the Persian Empire. It was called Susa. And some translations call it Shushan, but Susa was the winter capital of the Persian Empire. So in the wintertime, the kings would leave the northern part of Iran, modern-day Iran, and when they go to the southwest, which is where Susa was located. And they had a capital in multiple regions. Persepolis was the major capital, but Susa was, like I said, the winter capital. She lived in Susa. And the king of Esther, so he was Xerxes the first. And that'll factor in when we talk about some of his attempted conquest of Europe. But Xerxes reigned from about 486 BC to 465. Esther's name was not Hebrew. So Esther is actually a Persian word, and it means star. And so just like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Jews of the diaspora were given names that reflected the gods of the culture where they lived. So Esther's name was Hadassah, her Hebrew name, and that means myrtle. So her parents likely gave her that name because they love the myrtle trees in Israel. They're beautiful. And then her parents, we read in chapter 1, her parents had died. In chapter 2. So Esther was an orphan. And the only person there that could help raise Esther was Mordecai. So Mordecai was her cousin, an older cousin. And so to Mordecai, Esther was his daughter. He was not just a mentor, he was not just a counselor, he was like a father to her. And a lot of people say, well, Esther's just a fairy tale. If you look at the proof regarding the culture of the Persian Empire and all the detail we're given in Esther, it's clear that it's written about an actual time and an actual person. And of course, we believe that God's word is inerrant, regardless, from cover to cover. So what you read in Esther actually happened. And if you ever wanted to verify it, you could always travel to Iran. In northwest Iran, that image on the bottom is Esther and Mordecai's tomb. So they never left Persia. They were buried there. So Mordecai, Esther lived in the city of Susa. Mordecai was different. Mordecai lived in the palace. Presence in the king's gate, according to Esther 2, every single day indicates that he was probably a Persian official, because the king's gate is where the judges and the officials sat to do business. And Mordecai's name, just like Esther, Mordecai is not a Jewish name. It's based on a Babylonian god, Marduk. So the transliteration is Mardokiah, which was kind of morphed into Mordecai. And they found ancient texts in Babylon that actually have that name quite often. So it was a common name. And remember when we talked about Ezekiel, we talked about the city of Nippur in southern Babylon. Well, they found that name all over the city of Nippur as well. And Mordecai was no newcomer to exile. In fact, it was his great-grandfather that was taken out of Israel, along with King Jehoiakim. So Esther and Mordecai, along with many other Jews, were what you might call permanent exiles. They were never going home. And we'll talk about the declaration of Cyrus in a minute. They had the opportunity to leave, and they didn't. They remained in Babylon or in Persia. When we look at the records in the city of Nippur, and they found a room full of thousands of clay tablets, and they were all business transactions. And so Jewish names all over those records indicating buying and selling businesses, buying and selling property. They were prospering in exile. And it was very dangerous to return to Jerusalem. So building the temple seems to us as if the greatest mission in life, but it was extremely dangerous. There were robbers, there were bandits, there were armed forces opposing it. And so many Jews just decided to stay where they were. And they were loyal subjects of the Babylonian Empire, and then later the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. So the Septuagint, right, is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it was done so that the Jews that lived in the Hellenistic world could read God's Word. So they did not leave, many of them stayed. If you look at the characters of the Bible that actually were a part of these pagan empires, and that includes Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, of course, Esther and Mordecai, even Joseph. So Joseph in Pharaoh's court. It becomes clear that God has used his people over time in these empires to direct the path of that empire. Not at all unusual. And Esther and Mordecai, just like Daniel and his friends, they lived in two separate worlds. And we do the same, right? Two separate worlds. Our citizenship is in heaven, but we live in this fallen world. And we have to deal with the struggles that go along with that. Daniel and his friends were tested constantly. The lion's den, the fiery furnace, Esther, what happened to Esther, and those were testings that were really related to whether or not they would be faithful to God in that environment, in that pagan empire. And we are likewise tested daily on whether or not we're going to be faithful to our citizenship in heaven or faithful to a pagan empire. So that is something that God calls us to balance. It's a tension, not something that we can eliminate, not until we're in the kingdom anyway. So we're called to seek the good of the city where God has placed us. That's Jeremiah 29:7. But we're also called to seek the good of every man, especially those of the household of faith. So that is a balance that we have to deal with. So let's back up for just a minute and talk about Cyrus. So Cyrus the Great was the first Achaemenid king. So the Achaemenid Empire was the Persian Empire. And Cyrus kicked this empire off. And then there were 13 kings after Cyrus. Cyrus is an unusual figure in the Bible. He's mentioned 30 times. Isaiah actually called him the anointed of the Lord. So if you go and read Isaiah 45, you'll see these ways of referring to Cyrus. He also called him a shepherd who would actually rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So he's a pagan king. He worships Marduk. Later kings were Zoroastrian. They worshipped a monotheistic God, but none of them were the God of the Bible. He's a pagan king, and yet God called him the anointed of the Lord and a shepherd. And this prophecy in Isaiah was 150 years before Cyrus was even born. So Isaiah knew the name of the man and the time frame, and he put that in his book. And remember, Daniel was serving Nebuchadnezzar. Well, when the Babylonian Empire fell, Cyrus came in, and Daniel served Cyrus for the first 3 years of his reign. So some scholars believe that Daniel may have actually told Cyrus to look at Isaiah, to see the prophecy, and then to fulfill it. So we don't know if that happened. The Bible doesn't tell us. But we do know that in 539, the same year he conquered Babylon, he issued the Edict of Cyrus. And that edict is what said the Jews could leave. They could return home. They can go back to Jerusalem. He didn't just cut them loose. He gave them all the treasures from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. And then he opened up his own treasury and he paid for all the construction. And that's in Ezra 6. So it's amazing to me that God established Cyrus, he equipped Cyrus, he used him to actually fulfill that prophecy and to bless his covenant people. So there's a longer legacy for Cyrus. He had respect for the religions and the cultures of the nations that they conquered. That's how the Persians were able to let the Jewish people worship as they wanted and let them go home and rebuild the temple and even pay for the temple, because Cyrus believed that every culture under his empire had to be respected. And he issued something called the Cyrus cylinder, which is a large clay cylinder. But on the cylinder, you see what's typically called the first Declaration of Human Rights. Cyrus talks about the importance of the ability of people to worship as they want, the importance of being able to speak freely, the importance of all the things, many of the things that we consider fundamental American rights, you found on the Cyrus cylinder. It's very interesting to me. Alexander the Great conquered Persia, but he went to his tomb to show respect. Julius Caesar admired him. And then in our own American Revolution, we see people like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, reading about Cyrus. And his Cyropedia was in their library. And Thomas Jefferson actually had a copy of the Cyropedia with circles, underlines, scratchings, notes. He read it multiple times. So did it influence the Declaration of Independence? Or, the fundamental rights that we have as Americans? We can't say. Never done a one-to-one mapping, but it's very interesting. And if you read in Ezra 6:14 on the left there, it says, they finished their building by decree of the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So Ezra is telling us that the temple was finished. It was finished because God decreed it. But then it was finished because God decreed it, and then he told Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes to do it. So he used those pagan kings. And just one more context slide. So that's the Persian Empire at the time of Darius the Great. And so remember, Daniel served with Darius. And you can see it goes from India all the way over to parts of Greece. Huge. Yeah, this was the largest extent of the empire. Alexander's empire was a little bit larger, but this was huge. The Bible says it was 127 provinces. And this is the actual palace of Darius the Great. So this, if you read in Esther, you'll hear the citadel at Susa. This is the citadel at Susa. This is the archaeological excavation of the citadel. Look to the right and down, you'll see the Darius gate. This is where Mordecai sat in the gate. And then you can see the outer court, the middle court, and the inner court. And we'll talk a little bit later about the inner court. This is where Esther had to go. And that red box and the star was the location of the king's residence that Esther had to brave death to approach. This is just a sketch of what you just saw. The throne hall there is in blue on the left. But it was the winter capital, like we said. There were other capitals. The citadel was a royal residence and an administrative center. So a lot was done there. A lot of justice was administered. A lot of administration for the empire was there. And it's likely that Daniel lived there too. We know he lived in Babylon, but Daniel had one of his visions included the city of Susa. So it's likely that he lived in Susa at some point, and his tomb is maybe a mile away from here. But then we know that Nehemiah lived here, because in Nehemiah, the early chapters, you see that he was a cupbearer to Artaxerxes, and this was the palace of Artaxerxes. So let's talk a little bit about Xerxes, the king. So this is Esther's husband. And he was the fourth king of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius was his father. He wasn't as good a king as Darius. Definitely not as good a king as Cyrus. Secular historians really focus on his failed invasion of Greece. So we'll talk in a minute about that invasion. But we know him, like I said, as Esther's king. And the Achaemenid kings weren't like the Babylonian kings. In their mind, they were agents of God. They were established, they were given a divine mandate to eliminate chaos. And that was their goal, to eliminate chaos, to bring order. And so the first thing he did when he came to power was do just that. He put down rebellions in Egypt and in Babylon. Then he had this failed campaign in Greece. And then the rest of his reign was really just trying to build his father's capital in Persepolis. So not a lot of achievements for him. And then he was eventually assassinated by his own bodyguard. So not a great reign in general. So when we look at the first chapter in Esther, we hear about this feast. And the reason I love Esther is it's so descriptive, the language. It tells you how beautiful the embroidery was and the curtains and all the different, dinnerware. And what we hear is that it's a 180-day banquet. And there were officials there were nobles, there were governors. The Septuagint says officers. So it's likely that Not the entire Persian army was there, but the Persian high-ranking officers were there. And if you read Herodotus, you can connect the dots here. This was the era when Xerxes was planning his invasion of Greece. So this 180-day period wasn't just a banquet. He had these high-ranking army officers in, and they were talking about how to take Europe. 7 days in, after drinking for 7 whole days, they asked for Queen Vashti to be brought to the king. And she refused. No doubt she didn't want to be exhibited in front of a bunch of drunken men. And I can't blame her for that. But the title of queen was a gifted title. It wasn't hereditary. So he got so angry that he took her crown. And Queen Vashti was banished. And then there was a 4-year period there between her removal and selection of a new queen. And that 4-year period, scholars believe, is the time he was in Greece campaigning. So if you've read or seen the movie 300, I wouldn't recommend it. It's really bloody, terrible movie. But the concept of 300 Spartans stopping the invasion of the Persian Empire has been around since Thermopylae. And Xerxes was determined to avenge his father. So Darius had tried this 10 years previous. At the Battle of Marathon, they were soundly defeated and had to retreat. So Xerxes is going to get some revenge. He's going to get rid of that roadblock so they can just roll into Europe. Their style of warfare really was kind of a standoffish. They had a bunch of archers, and they would just shoot a bunch of arrows, and the enemy could never get close. Well, the problem is the Spartans didn't care about arrows. They were heavily armored, and they had shields as big as me, and they covered them and protected them from the arrows. So they closed the distance quickly, and the Achaemenid archers wore robes. They wore silk garments. They were not protected at all. So the Spartans inflicted heavy casualties. So a 1,000,000-man Persian army was stopped at Thermopylae. And because of that narrow pass, they couldn't get through. But subsequent battles took such a heavy toll that Xerxes had to go back home. So while that campaign is going on, there's a search for a queen. So Xerxes put in every province an official, an overseer, who could find the most beautiful women and asked them to be brought to the palace. Esther happened to be one of those women. She was brought into the citadel. And of course, Mordecai, we read that Mordecai followed Esther, and he kept an eye on her. Wherever she went in the palace, Mordecai was there to make sure she was okay. But they brought in women from all over the empire. Esther found such favor in the eyes of the eunuch for the king that she was given choice food, cosmetics, and 7 hand-picked maids. So for a year, these women went through like a spa day. And at the end of that beautification period, each woman went into the king. And because Esther had found favor with the eunuch and with everyone in the court and with the king, she did not join the harem as a concubine. She actually was crowned Queen of Persia. And Esther 2:17 tells you why. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen. So the most important part, I think, of the book of Esther is this plot. And remember, Mordecai is sitting in the king's gate. He's listening to all the other officials. And he overhears 2 officials. And they're in charge of security for the king, but they're talking about how to actually kill him. Mordecai carries that message to Esther. She carries it to the king, and they're both hung. But in God's providence, the king doesn't remember what Mordecai had done for him. So he was never rewarded. He was never commended. Nothing ever happened. And we'll find out why that's important in just a minute. And so one of those officials was Haman, and the Bible calls him an Agagite. So remember Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And Saul was told to kill the Amalekites and Agag, their king, and he didn't do it. And so there was this centuries-long hatred of the Jews coming out of the Amalekites. And Haman happened to be descended from Agag, the actual king. And he was elevated to a position of authority. You can see there in Esther 3:1. When he came in the gate, everyone bowed to him except Mordecai. Mordecai was from the line of Saul. Mordecai knew who Agag was. And there's no possible way Mordecai was going to bow down to an Agagite. And it enraged Haman so much that he hatched a plan. And his plan was to convince Xerxes to exterminate the Jews. And so in Esther 3:13 it says, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. So of course, when this edict comes out, Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. He's walking around Susa weeping. The people of Susa are confused because they have Jewish friends, they have Jewish relatives, and they love the Jews, and they're confused. Why should we kill these people? And Esther, when she heard about the edict, the Bible says she writhed in great anguish. And it's not just because the Jews of the diaspora were going to be killed. Remember, Israel was in the Persian Empire. So every Jew that had gone back to rebuild the temple would also be killed. Every single Jew in the Persian Empire was going to be killed. And Mordecai, this is where he pleaded with her to go into Xerxes and tell him what was happening. Then Esther reminded Mordecai, anyone who approaches the king in his chamber, that little area we showed with the red star, anyone that approached that area without being summoned would be killed. And I'm assuming, just like, you know, the tag on your hairdryer that says do not use in the tub, I'm assuming someone went into that chamber and wound up getting killed. So Esther was terrified, rightfully so. And this is where Esther 4:14 comes in. You can see Mordecai's belief that God would raise up deliverance regardless. But he encouraged her and told her that she has come to the kingdom for just such a time. So she asked Mordecai and the Jewish people to fast and pray for 3 days, and she did as well, and then she went into the king. So she walked in. Of course, he spared her. He would hold down a golden scepter if he wanted to spare that person, and you touched the golden scepter and you were good. So not only did he spare her, he promised to give her anything up to half of the kingdom that she asked for. And unlike me, or most of you probably would have spilled the beans right then, she didn't. She had a plan. And Haman was so overjoyed at this plan because the plan included him, joining them for a private banquet, that he determined, well, since I have favor with the king and I have favor with the queen, I'm just going to get rid of Mordecai. So he built a gallows, 30-meter tall gallows, huge. And he's preparing to hang Mordecai and be done with the Jews. So the evening before the meal, this is how God's providence factors in when we're talking about sleep. So if you've ever woken up at 3 a.m. and your heart is unsettled and you need to pray, that's what happened here. So Xerxes woke up. He couldn't sleep. He reached over, he grabbed the book of records, which is the book of the chronicles of the kings of the Medes and the Persians. So basically everything they did was written down. And he's reading through there, and of course God sovereignly places him on the page where Mordecai saved his life. And he said, what's been done for this man? And the servant said, well, nothing. We forgot about him. So he called for Haman, of all people. And to Haman's horror, he instructed him to make sure that Mordecai was honored. He had to dress him in a robe. He had to parade him around the city. He had to bow to him. He kind of knew that the worm had turned. At some point, he went home, told his wife was like, you're in serious trouble. And then that private dinner that Esther had requested, that's where she spilled the beans. And of course, Xerxes was enraged. He left. This is a fascinating, it describes really the details of this scene. He leaves, and then Haman comes over, falls on his knees in front of Esther, and kind of falls on her almost. And then the king walks back in, and he sees, Haman doing that, and he says, he's going to assault the queen right here in the palace. And they hung him that hour. they took him out and put him on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And so as we're wrapping up the book of Esther, around chapter 9, that's where we get this long description of how the Jews were to celebrate this deliverance. We won't go into the detail, but obviously the Jews were not exterminated. The king gave them his seal, his ring, and he said, you write out whatever edicts you want to protect the Jews. And they did. And so you'll read about the Feast of Purim in chapter 9, and then of course Mordecai is elevated to become the prime minister. So the story ends really well. I think you'll enjoy it. It's just so well written. And there's a couple points we want to hit real quick. And the first is that God's covenant faithfulness is on every page. You may not see God cited on every page of Esther, but you see his covenant faithfulness. You see the sovereignty of God playing out. God didn't just save the Jews in the diaspora. He saved the Jews that had gone back to rebuild the temple through Esther. And then Esther typified Christ in that she was willing to go in, regardless of the consequences, which she thought was probably her death, willing to go in and lay her life down for the entire Jewish nation. And though God was not explicitly mentioned, like we said, he was in complete control of every single event. Mordecai was not rewarded initially because the king needed to read about Mordecai's deeds later. So everything in the story is engineered by God's sovereign hand. And the last point here is silence is not an option. It wasn't an option for Esther. She couldn't remain silent. And it's not really an option for us either. Like I said, we are all here for such a time as this. This is the time God's allotted to us. And we can't remain silent. I mean, it's very encouraging to hear about the debate on the bill and the fact that people from this class showed up and were there to advance the gospel, there to protect the unborn. There are so many Hamans in this country that need to be exposed. So many evil plots, right? Abortion itself, it doesn't exterminate in one day. It's taken decades, 63 million dead. There's so many Hamans, there's so many plots that need to be exposed. And the only way we can be salt and light here is to not only preserve, but to illuminate that evil and to stand against it.